Hash Hush and Circle Up.
Welcome to On, the Hash House Harrier podcast for interviews, history, and stories. I'm your host, Ra.
Today on the podcast, we're in South America with a British citizen who's traveled around the world and obviously still traveling. Hashed a lot of places, well known, well liked. Welcome today on the podcast, Deli Boy.
Thank you very much, Ra. It's good to see you. We were just trying to work out when we last saw each other, and it was quite a while ago.
I think it was this millennium. That's it.
That's about as good as we're going to get.
Let's introduce you with your hashing origin story. When, where, and how did you get to your first hash?
Sure. The first hash, and that's where I got my name from, although I got it after I left the place in India, New Delhi, and in India. I was a member of the UK Foreign Service for well over 30 years, and my first posting was in the High Commission in New Delhi. And when I got there, people talked about two things that you needed to do when you're in Delhi. And one was to go to the Australian bar on a Friday night. And the second thing that you needed to do was to go on the hash, which was at the traditional time of a Monday evening. As someone who at school had hated cross-country running and always did my best to avoid it, it took me a couple of months before I was persuaded to go and join the hash. But I think once I did it once, I never looked back. And with the support of another lady hasher there, who I don't think ever had a name, Sue Ewer, we encouraged each other to go and then carried on. And I did that for the 3.5 years that I was there.
What was the first year? When did it start?
So it started in 1985. I got to Delhi in August 1985, and I started running, I think it was in October 85. Yeah, that's when I first started hashing. So it was a few years ago.
That's before the internet. How did everybody find where the hash was going to be the following run?
Yeah.
How did visitors find it?
Yeah, I think at the time, this is when hashing was still really focused on embassies, on high commissions, certainly on the expat lifestyle there. We got, if you know about Delhi, I mean, we had some big packs there. It was centered around the British High Commission, but with support from the Canadians, the Americans, the Australians. There were a handful of Indians who used to come along. Someone who, very famous hasher, Avi Bindra, who lots of people know and who loved fondly when he was with us. He was always a stalwart of the hash. So the Delhi hash had been formed by a guy called Charlie Stevens, who I think had ran in Islamabad, and he started it about 3 years before I arrived, I think. So it was still very much focused around the embassies. We used to run from people's houses down in probably about 3-4 miles from the diplomatic area where most of the diplomats and foreigners lived. And India is just a great place to hash because everyone had big houses, everyone had big gardens. Let's be blunt about it. Everyone had lots of servants who could help supply regular quantities of beer and great food. It was a tremendous place to hash. And for 3.5 years, I did that very well. This was, as you say, before the internet. Visitors, if we had any visiting hashers, they'd usually just try and clock in with one of the embassies or the high commissions, and that's how they'd get to us.
What was it like? Apart from big crowds, what was the traditions, the circle, the singing?
Yeah, in the garden. Now I've got to stretch my memory. So the packs were biggish at the time. We were very unusual. We'd have a pack of under 40, and we would regularly have packs going up to 100. That's when hashing was its height, I would have thought. And I'll be honest, there wasn't a huge amount more to do in Delhi at that time. Obviously, it's changed a lot since then, and it's a vibrant, thriving city. But at the time, it wasn't so much. So we'd all get out, we'd drag the beer up, collect all the beer from the British High Commission. There were about 4 drays. We'd load it into cars, take it off to someone's house, and get the ice ready. And then it was a running trail. There were a handful of walkers, but at the time, most people were much younger than the age of your average hasher these days. So it was basically running. And then, a good crack afterwards with sort of some of the traditional hash songs. There was a particular song, which I'm not going to sing for you, which the Delhi hash developed for himself, about being a Delhi Walla. But otherwise, it was some of the old traditional songs. He's a hasher type of stuff. Quite a few regular events. Big numbers, so we'd have a big party. We went and did quite a few trips outside of Delhi, went up to Dehradun, up in the Himalayan foothills, went down to a couple of sort of fort-type hotels in Rajasthan, did some cracking weekends away as well, which were, very good. And it was really well supported, 50, 60, 70 hashes going for these weekends away.
What did you get involved in organizing or mismanagement there?
Yeah, pretty quickly, really, and because anyone who's from the British High Commission, we organised all the beer, we organised all the ice. So if you're in the High Commission, you had a role almost automatically as being a hash dray to drag the beer across. But then as I went on, I started to do a little bit more. I became the hash scribe. I used to write a weekly rum report. And again, this was in the days before the internet. So we used to type it out. We used to copy and paste photos in, or not stick them in. And then we get it to myself or the lady I mentioned earlier, Sue. She would type it all up, run off lots of photocopies, and just pass them out at the next hash. And that's how it was at the time. You can't recognise it from how things go these days. But that was, yeah. So I did that. And then I became the joint master. I was the joint master for a couple of years. So I used to stand in for the RA when the RA was away, and I used to stand in for the Grand Master when he was away. Somebody had made what they called a soap box. So whoever was doing the ceremonies, we used to stand on the soapbox. And I'm not short of a few centimetres, about 195 centimetres. So by the time I stood on the soapbox, I was literally towering over absolutely everybody. But yeah, good. Yeah, circles. Sometimes lots of people. Circles went on a little bit too much sometimes, but I think those were the days when it didn't matter quite so much. People didn't have homes to go to.
Did any of those hash trashes that you wrote survive? Were they kept there? Did you keep any of the early?
Yeah, I don't think I've got any loose ones, but some of them were printed in. We had a yearbook. All the committee were involved in producing a yearbook, trying to put in photos and stuff. And I've still got quite a few of them. I was there for 3.5 years, so I must have probably 3 or 4 of those. And they used to paste in 1 or 2 into the yearbooks. But otherwise, no, I didn't keep it running. But I don't think anyone, as far as I can remember, kept a sort of history of Delhi hash write-ups or anything.
Were they keeping run counts?
Yes, they were. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so they were doing that at the time. So I think I can't remember up to about 130, I think it was in Delhi by the time I left.
You were traveling around India for hashing and over Himalayas, maybe across some borders. When did you figure out the whole world scope, how big hashing was?
Yeah, it was really when I was there. That's when I started. And I remember going up to Islamabad. There were 2 hashes in Islamabad at the time. Myself and a mate went up there to see some friends, and I ran both hashes whilst I was there. And then there was a time when I was single, so I was traveling around. I travelled around and did some holidays in parts of the Far East. And when did I hatch? I had a couple of times in Singapore, Lion City, and Seletar, I think. I hashed in Hong Kong on South Side. This was just as a visitor. Regrettably, I didn't hash in Malaysia. I hashed a couple of times, but quite a bit after when I went there with my wife. I hashed in the Philippines on the Puerto Galera hash. That was at a time when we were all pretty reliant on Tim Magic Hughes' book. And you just try and keep that up to date, and you'd go in, perhaps try and send a fax, or you'd phone up an embassy, or you'd try and get in contact with a hash house, turn up and keep your fingers crossed, really.
Yeah, Islamabad, that's a club that no longer exists. So you were there in a time when, like you say, that was the decade of the hash explosion, maybe, where everywhere there was a consulate or an embassy, there probably was a hash around the world.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And there were the 2 hashes there in Islamabad that I ran with. There was a men's hash, and then I ran on a mixed hash as well whilst I was there.
Do you remember anything about that? That's a pretty conservative place.
I just think, again, I think because lots of the foreigners lived in quite decent sized houses or lived on compounds, you could actually get away with just going out for a run and then coming back and drinking as much beer as you wanted in private. And I think it was probably less conservative there than it is now. I used to drink the local Murray beer up in Islamabad when I visited, and visited a couple of times. And so I never felt it was an issue at the time. Since I've been hashing in other places in other parts, and it obviously is more so.
Well, where'd you go when that term ended? Around before the 1990, yeah.
Yeah, so I was there from 85 to 88. I went back to London for a few months, for about 6-9 months. I started hashing with Barnes Hash. I started running with Barnes, 2 reasons really. One, there was a guy who used to visit Delhi quite regularly who was a Barnes hasher. So he said, when you come back, you've got to come and run with Barnes. And I lived not far from Barnes when I was living in London, which made life easier for me. And also Barnes at the time ran at 8 o'clock. When I was working in London, I found it quite difficult to get out to West London and City for sort of 6:30, 7 o'clock. So Barnes became my home hash in London. I did run and I continue to run West London as and when I can. And I think that they're a great crowd in West London. I really enjoy running with them. But Barnes became my home hash. And then obviously I did that for about 6 or 9 months, and then off to Cairo, where I bumped into you. They're good mates from Cairo. And I did 3 years there, and then sort of got involved in the committee. I think again I might have been right doing the scribing there as well.
I
But
think
you probably got a better memory about it than me.
I think you were the scribe the entire time you were there.
Really? That's a
I
bit
think
sad,
so.
isn't it?
And we would have fill-in writers who would take their hand whenever you were out of the country. Who was the person who got you and Barnes connection? What was that name?
He used a hasher called John Buss, Buss. And I'll tell you what, I two things. I don't know whether he had a hash name, and I have to confess, I'm not even sure whether he's still with us, because he's one of those hashers who had quite a few years on me. I haven't heard or come across him for years and years.
Cairo was about to explode in size when you got there. Maybe it was the size of Delhi when you got there. And then we grew with the same situation of there wasn't that much else to do. There was a British club, a rugby club, and not that much else going on.
Exactly. And it became the highlight of the week, really, didn't it? It's going out to Woody Digler and wherever else we used to go to, the sand dunes up on the Ismailia Road. And that was the highlight of the Friday afternoon. I had this sort of very beaten up old military Jeep, which had a sort of no roof on it, or I did get one built and put it over the cab for the winter when it got a bit wet. And I used to load up as many people, as much beer as I possibly could into it. And I think you probably had 1 or 2 very bumpy rides in the back of that out to the hash.
Yeah, the way the expats lived, we can talk a little bit about Cairo. The British Embassy and Consulate were downtown.
That's right.
A lot of the Americans lived in the suburb of Mahdi. British, German were over in Mohandasin. So we had people at Heliopolis, oil guys out there. So we actually had a giant, sprawling 20 million person city with hashers in every corner. Yeah, think about that. So people could get rides from anywhere. It's not like that now. It's all centered in Mahdi. It was, I think, we're talking about the early 90s, the heyday.
Yeah, sorry, 90 to 93 I was there. Sorry, 90 to 93. Yeah.
So that's the heyday of expat cities with no drink driving laws, with almost no laws for foreigners, still a hands-off life.
Yeah, no, you're looking back, you're not particularly proud of probably some of the times that you drove home. But you're right, I think those were a little bit Wild Westish in some ways. And the sort of things that you would never even contemplate doing these days. But at the time, it happened. It happened. Absolutely. Yeah, and that vehicle I had, this army-painted open-top Jeep driving around the middle of Egypt. It's just the sort of thing that you just could never do these days. Absolutely.
You had a diplomatic license plate on it?
Yeah, it did have a license plate on it, which would have made it an even higher profile vehicle if anyone was that way inclined. But thankfully at the time, actually, Cairo was a really safe place for women. Some women had a few problems up in the Khan with a little bit of annoyance. But actually, my wife Sharon, she used to wander around the streets by herself in the evening and stuff, having been out with friends, and she never had any problems whatsoever. So I think it was at the time, it was a remarkably safe place as well.
And for the hash's credit, we rarely would run in the city in our shorts screaming. We had access to the desert, and those places are all gone. The giant sand dunes are gone. They're condos now. The petrified forest is nearly a protected small bit and rest gone. Yeah. It was a great heyday. And the busy expat life, it was just for people maybe haven't been expats. The hash people were, since it was such a big community, we were part of everything. So when all the Scottish balls and Irish balls and British and Australian, everything happened, the hash was in the middle of it. So it was
you're absolutely right. And things like the Digler Dash, when people did that, and then the Cairo River thing that you always used as an excuse to dress up as a lady in.
And now raft race,
the raft race, that's it, of course, So you're absolutely right. And there were people from lots of different, obviously quite a few oilies, people from the gas fields, quite a lot of teachers, quite a lot of embassy people, obviously from different parts. Again, a handful of locals, not too many. I'm obviously only the locals that were prepared to come and put up with us and join in the alcoholic fun. But yeah, it was great. It was just a great way. The hash, I think at this time, the hash was a really good way of meeting people. And that's why people just dove straight into it when they got to a place, because they knew they'd immediately find a fairly like-minded community and immediately find people that they got on with and enjoyed the company of. I think these days, everyone's got much more to do. There is much more to do. And I think that the needs that the hash answered are not quite there as much as they used to be.
Just again, the times, the politics, and the rise of a bit of fundamentalism and issues with Cairo. Did any of that happen before you left?
There was a little bit happening, but it was down in Upper Egypt. So Cairo itself whilst I was there were no major incidents in Cairo. The biggest incident was in the region I guess it was Saddam's first invasion of Kuwait. And there were quite a lot of Kuwaitis that got stuck in Egypt and Alexandria at the time because they couldn't go back home. So that was the biggest issue, really. But that was the time when Mubarak, he led with a fairly iron fist. And it did actually lead to Cairo and Egypt generally, but Cairo in particular Alexandria being fairly safe places to be. And I was going to all of that changed.
You had a normal length tour there, the 3+ years.
Yeah, I had 3 years there, and I still did a bit of travel hashing. It's probably worth highlighting the fact that I did run on the Damascus hash. I also ran on the Sana'a hash in Yemen. What else did I do? We went on holiday and I did a few hashes in the Far East as well. So I did the Puerto Galera hash, which was quite an interesting hash. If you're interested in a fairly sexist story about the hash, apologies if I offend anyone, but it was a special run on the Puerto Galera hash, and which is on an island just away from where the mainland part where Manila is. And we got a ferry across, and I went and I got a local took to the hash. And after hash, when the circle came up, all the male hashers had to throw in one of their running shoes into the circle. After which a quite attractive Filipina lady was brought out to choose the running shoe to win the raffle prize, and she was, of course, the raffle prize. Again, I apologise if I offend anyone, but again, those were the times and perhaps some of the antics that went on in the hashing in that part of the world.
And where did you go next?
Where did I go next? Then I went back and I did actually have quite a long spell in the UK. Long spell by my standards. I had nearly 4 years in the UK. So that was 93 to 97. And that's when I ran all the time with Barnes. So up to about 140 runs, I think I did with Barnes. Sometimes they were too far away and I couldn't get to them. Sometimes I was working, sometimes I was travelling. I ran a few times West London. I ran with some of the other local hashes there. The Twat hash, the Twickenham, Whitton and Peddington hash, the Twat hash I used to run with. I ran the 1996 leap year hash, and you might have seen the other day that I ran the 2024 leap year hash as well.
Oh, yeah.
Quite a long time after. And also, that's the first time I started paying any attention to any of the big events that we were going on. Duncan, Condon Man, and myself went across, we rented a room and went across to Cyprus for the Interhash, and that was my first Interhash.
That was a place where Surrey combined with Barnes for one of the historic hash skits.
Yes, not involved, I must say.
Yeah. But how were Surrey and Barnes partnering on other stuff?
They were, because it was a fairly similar crowd. So the RA at the time, or the RA perhaps earlier, perhaps not then, was a hasher called Nick Seymour, whose hash nickname was Napoleon. And he was the GM, the GM of Surrey, and he'd been the GM of Barnes. In fact, he was the guy that gave me my hash nickname of Delhi Boy. Now, we got the hash nickname for 2 reasons, really. One, because there was a famous TV character called Del Boy at the time, and one of the hashers on Barnes was called Del Boy. And the other reason was that Barnes was, even at the time, one of the more mature hashes in the UK. And at the time, I was, late 20s, early 30s or something. So I did reduce the average age of the hash by a little bit. So I could, hence got the nickname Delhi Boy. But that's an aside. Surrey and Barnes used to cooperate quite a bit, and there's some of the similar crowd. Barnes in the summer used to go and run out in Surrey territory. In the winter, they tended to run more around southwest London.
Cyprus was a fairly big diversion from Interhash. It had been in Sydney a long time earlier, but it was a hot weekend. What do you remember about Cyprus Interhash and this giant event?
Not really much, to be quite honest. It must be because I drank perhaps we all drank more than we should have done. I did a Dubai Creek sort of run beforehand. I think what else I did. Oh, do you know what, to be honest, I'm struggling to remember, Matthew. I really am struggling. Signs of old age, I'm
yeah,
afraid.
yeah, it was nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah,
But
I think it was good. I mean, it was good for the European hashes, especially for the UK hashes, because it meant actually that the participation from the European hashes was much, much bigger than it had been when it had been out of the Far East.
yeah, for me, that was a very cool event because I was still in Cairo nearby. So I went up a week ahead and I was helping to put the wrapping. We had translucent paper stuff that we wrapped the entire venue so people
Yeah,
couldn't see it and be just. And Tim Magic Hughes was there.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I worked side by side with him post holing and wrapping this stuff.
yeah,
And I think that might have been close to the end of his hashing and the end of his life. I don't think
yeah,
he made
yeah.
it to another inner hash after
Sure.
that.
No,
And
I think it was at Cairo. That was the only time I actually met him face to face, having used his book as a Bible for traveling around various places. Yeah, and I think all I said, I would have, whatever hash you raid, I would have done it, because it was a chance for Condo Man and myself to meet up with you and experience the delights of your circle.
yeah, it was fun. Now, what about Barnes and or
Yeah.
Surrey doing the write ups? Did they have a hash trash?
No, that's a good question. I certainly wasn't involved in any of that. And whether they did or not, do you know what? I'm sorry, I can't remember. I think it was less a common thing in the UK than it had been overseas. That said, one or two of the hashes still do write-ups. I've run a couple of times with Weybridge hash here, and a guy religiously does the write-ups and sticks them on the Facebook page every week. So I think that's the way that it's probably changed like that people perhaps do it. Perhaps they send them out to WhatsApp groups. So there's another hash I think I'm going to saw some on a WhatsApp group. And then obviously other hashes will send out streams of photos to WhatsApp groups, Facebook pages, whatever afterwards. So I think that sort of thing still happens. It just happens in a more modern world way.
I think the 10, 15, 20 years of write ups, it took people like you who would say, I'll do it every week, who enjoyed it and would say, somehow you didn't write the same thing every week. Of course, the details changed, but it was something for entertaining. And that's something that, yeah, I think it's a minority of hashes would do
Yeah,
now because it's just online. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a
I
great
should
part.
actually you just reminded me of something. I should probably put in a word for my wife, who you obviously know, but who is not a hasher. And actually, I do remember now that I used to write these articles up and take them down to her. She was working in the embassy in Cairo, and she used to type them all up and then use the embassy photocopiers to do all the copying for me. So I should pat her on the back for doing that.
Oh, then how did you make your decision? You had a long stay in Britain. Was that choice? Was that an option? How
No, it was really because I'd been away for a fair bit. I had to do a stint back home. So I did. It was nearly just short of 4 years working there. And I'd applied for a couple of postings. In fact, I nearly went back. I nearly went to Islamabad, but then various things meant it changed. And I ended up going down to Bogota in Colombia instead, which is obviously coincidentally where I'm here for a couple of weeks' work at the moment.
scale? What was the scale of that embassy compared to Cairo?
All very small. I think there must have been about 20 British expats. And the big thing to think about in Colombia at the time was that Colombia was a really quite a difficult place to be. It was it was a couple of years after the death of Escobar. All the cartels had broken up, but there was a very high instance, a high level of crime. The extremist groups, the terrorist groups, the ELN and the FARC were right on the borders of Bogota, on the edges of Bogota. And every time you wanted to go out of the city, we used to have to seek police permission to do so. It was quite a difficult place to be in a way. I came out, my daughter was 3 months old when we came out. I started to have one or two other sort of, not concerns, but other things going on in my life that meant that hashing, I won't say it took a back seat because it didn't, but when I arrived, there wasn't a hash here. There had been a hash a few years before, which had been run out of a pub, which a couple of expats ran. But when I arrived, that pub was closed and the expats were no longer there. So for the first 9 months, when I was here, there wasn't a hash. And then myself, and I bumped into a guy who worked for Shell, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name, not his first name, nor his hash name. But he used to live about 2 blocks down from where I lived in North Bogota. And he'd been hashing in the Middle East. I think he'd been in Oman or Saudi, he'd been hashing there. So we decided to give it a go. So we put the word around, we send out flyers to all the embassies. He tried to drag up support from Shell and from some of the other oil companies that were working here in Colombia at the time. And we initially started it and it ran for the rest of my time whilst I was here, which was just over 2 years. But
Wow.
we only ran it once a month. We couldn't run it any more regularly because it was really him and I just doing it. Two issues. One was finding a safe location. And the second issue was not being able to just put it out there that here was a hash, because there were people, unfortunately, there were people, criminals and extremist groups, who may well have been very interested at the time. So we kept it to once a month. We kept it within a fairly small community. But we did get clearance to go out of town on a few times, a few occasions, and we went out to some local restaurants, and we went down to a hotel an hour and a half outside of Bogota, which was run by some expats, and we ran there. And we used to run sometimes in the sort of safer parts of the city, and sometimes in the safer areas just on the edge of town. So yeah, so that was it. I was the GM here, and so GM on the circuit, ended up doing everything whilst I was here.
Did you guys ever make a T-shirt?
We did make some T-shirts, and I've been in touch with the Bogota hash since, and I ran a couple of times here with the Bogota hash when I'm visiting, and in fact I'm running with them on Saturday. And I did fish out some of the old Bogota stuff I had, which was a couple of run reports. I can't remember what else it was, a couple of stickers or something, and I sent it across to the hash that's currently being run here by Crystal. I can't remember her hash name. So yeah, there were one or two things. There was a T-shirt. It had a picture of Colombia with painted in the yellow, blue, red, the Colombian flag. It was slashed right across it. I survived the Bogota hash. Nothing particularly original, and I wish I'd have kept one, but I didn't.
Were you able to travel regionally, or was the whole place a mess?
No, I traveled a little bit. I ran in Caracas. I ran when I visited Guatemala, and I also ran in Panama City. Yeah, in the country Panama, not yet United States, Panama City. I mean, I managed to hook up with the hashes in all of those countries. What a great way to see parts of a city or a country that you would never see. And that's one of the great reasons I always do it. I always visit parts of a city I would never otherwise see.
Did anybody ever visit you there while you were living?
No. I did have a few friends came across, yeah, but not very many. Not very many. Family came across a couple of times, but again, you were fairly limited. You could go up to Cartagena in the north, and that was a fairly safe area. But otherwise, the people go on holiday down to Medellin and Cali and other parts of the coffee growing zone, and all of those were pretty much out of bounds when I was here. Yeah. So although I spent 3 years in Colombia, I actually know very little of it and have seen very little of it, which is a bit of a shame, really.
This might not be the most pleasant topic. It's something that's off the radar now. Is there ever discussion or people talking about what happened with the tragedy in Medellin with the Inner Americas GM getting shot?
Yeah, I don't know. It's odd, really. This is about the 5th time I think I've visited here, and because only since I semi-retired from the Foreign Office, I did consulting work now. So I think this is the 4th or the 5th time that I visited here. This will be the 3rd time I've coincided with a hash, because they only hash once a month, so I'm not always able to do it. I have actually changed my flights to make sure I did get here on time for a hash, because obviously having been GM here and having founded it for a while, and I've got a bit of a soft spot for it. I say there obviously was a hash once before, then it closed, then I set it up again, and then it closed. And I think Pablo Piscobar set it up again, and it closed. I think the first time I came back and I hashed here, and actually Pablo Piscobar was up for a visit, and I was here as well. And then there was obviously the current GM who was here. So it was almost some sort of record that there were 3 current and ex-Bogota GMs who were all running at the same time. And obviously I was only there for the day, and it's the one and only time that I met Pablo Piscobar. And obviously I've seen what's happened, and but he met him once, shows what it's a judge of character, but seemed a great guy.
Yeah. I did interview him, and I was speaking to him a week before he was killed. Yeah. So I haven't ever published it. It was pretty dodgy. He was using solar powered Wi-Fi out where he was, but I do have a recording of his voice, so I don't know. That's something. Okay, so you've been now.
I mean, aside from obviously what went on with the Americas Interhash, I mean, obviously just a tremendously sad thing as well. No matter what he did, and obviously I know the two things are unconnected, but it's still a very sad thing for it to happen.
So we're now talking 80s, 90s, zeros, ones, 5th decade across 5 decades of hashing. And through this whole time, you've been hashing in the UK, from being the boy on the hash.
Yeah, I say not all the time. What did I do? I went to Athens immediately after Bogota. I went to Athens and spent 4 or 5 years there and hashed there again. I was the RA and did JM and stuff and helped out whenever I could, did the beer and stuff. And that hash was a good fun hash at the time. But also as a hash, by this time I had 3 kids. So they used to come along on the hash. My son and the youngest one was in the back. The eldest 2 was 5 and 4 or 6 and 4. And my son used to pour the beers and things like that. And in fact, of those 3, the only one who still occasionally does a hash with me is the youngest, who's now 23, and she's quite a good runner. And she'll come out and hash with me these days. So I did that. And then it was after Athens I went back. And I found that I really couldn't hash anymore. I was living outside of London. There were a few local hashes, but by the time I was leaving for work at the morning at 7, for work at 7 in the morning, I was getting back at 7:30 at night. And hashing with 3 young kids in the UK at the time just wasn't something I could do. And then I went on a couple of other postings by myself. I went to Erbil in North Iraq, and there was no hash there at the time. Security situation wouldn't have allowed a hash. Then I went back to the UK for a little bit, a couple of years again. Family circumstances didn't allow me to hash. And then I went to Kabul for 18 months, and again, there wasn't hash there. So I really should have started hashing after Kabul. I went straight to Madrid, and I really should have started hashing there. But I'll be quite honest with you, Madrid was such an amazing place to be that I didn't, not to say I didn't need a hash, but I just, there was so much else going on at the weekend. And they used to run on a Sunday that I just never hooked up with a hash. And it was only when I left Madrid, went back to the UK, retired at 55, and had time on my hands that I found the hash again. So that's since 2018, and really fell back straight into the swing of hashing, of travel hashing in the UK, hashing in London, and just carried on where I left off 12 years previously, really. So I did have that big hiatus, which probably means I'm not a very good hasher, but there you go. It happened.
But you do have the span of over 30 years of looking how it's changed. So lots of hashers have gone on, new people come. And what do you think is the state of hashing in the UK compared to what it's in?
It's difficult, isn't it? Let's be honest about it. It's probably a dying breed, isn't it? I don't know what you think. I see hashes getting smaller wherever I go as well. And I'm still traveling a lot. I was in Jordan a month ago. I'm just trying to think what else I've run just recently. I ran in Kiev before Putin did his stuff. I ran in Azerbaijan when I visited there. I ran back in Delhi. I ran on Capital Hash there. And everywhere hash I go, since I've been traveling and doing the consultancy work I'm doing now, I just see smaller numbers. I see a much more aged hash population. And it was of its time, I think. I don't think it will probably continue in pockets, but I don't think it can continue in the numbers. It'll never reach the numbers that it used to have. And I think it will die out in a lot of places.
Yeah, and can't really be called a running club anymore.
No, I think you're probably right as well. I am just about still a runner. And I do run, and I'll run hopefully I'll do my 5 miles, I'll do my 8 clicks, and okay, I'm stopping more than I used to, but I am still a runner. And to be honest, it was one of the main reasons why I got back into it, because I'd retired at 55, which is quite early, and I was doing this consultancy work. I found out I was going away. I was sitting in hotels for a week or 2 weeks and doing bugger all. Then actually starting the hash overseas, but again, back home, when I'm back home, and running with at the moment down in Hampshire, it was a really great way of me actually trying to sort myself out a little bit and starting to do some exercise and starting to think a little bit more about a body that had probably been a little bit abused for a while with too much of the good life. So yeah, I guess that was the reasoning behind it. But I run now. My hash in the UK now is the R2D2 hash. Sometimes there's 20, sometimes there's 40. I also run with the Didcot hash because that's quite close to where I live, and sometimes that's probably between about 8 and 20 hashes, probably about 8 runners, the rest are walkers. R2D2 is probably about half, slightly more walkers than there are runners. And there's a couple of others. Winchester, I sometimes run Winchester, sometimes I run Hursley, which are all down in the Hampshire area. But again, most of those are fairly similar crowd. There's quite a lot of cross-pollination, fertilization between the hashes down in that part of the world. So you get people who will run 3 or 4 hashes a week. People who run a hell of a lot more hashes than I have. I might have run in a few more countries than some. There's one guy on R2D2. So Paul, he used 1,200-1,300 hashes just with the R2D2. He's in his 80s, you know. Still going.
You have a great list of cities that you've been to. I've been in Erbil, which was it was the nicest place of Iraq I've been to. It was pretty nice, but yeah, no hashing for there. But places like Athens, which are a big tourist center, I just found that a great place to be. Very friendly hash, and when I've
Yes.
gone, it was a great place. Hashes in big cities where tourism is still safe is a great thing. Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I haven't run that Athens hash since I left, which was 2005, but I still follow them on Facebook and I'm still in contact with a couple of the Athens hashes. In fact, I bumped into one guy called Pussy Basher at the Leap Year Hash in London last week. And he's an Athens hasher and he was across. So he's hashes in London and hashes in Athens. But it's a much smaller crowd. I think the same hardcore that were there when I was there who lived permanently in Greece. But yeah, and they still do good weekend aways. If you want a nice island weekend away, keep an eye on what the Athens Hash are doing because they're always a good weekend away.
Yeah, it was such a friendly group. I showed up there once on somebody's doorstep from a 7 a.m. flight from Cairo, and they just said, "Here's the keys. We got to go to work. There's the car. Try not to break anything." And they set up all kind of events. Yeah, it's just a great thing. And
There is still that.
a man Jordan is a great place to hash.
Yeah. So I thought I'd hashed there before, but because I'm a bit of a sad, I did check my records and I found out that I hadn't hashed there before. I'd hashed in Damascus and was getting confused with the two. But I was there about a week ago, and yeah, I mean, a really nice and welcoming group. I mean, all of them, all Jordanians, no expats running. I was the only foreigner on the run, but it's quite funny because I met there a guy who I had met 3 weeks previously running on the hash in Nairobi.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Small world, Hash's world, eh? He's a Jordanian. His wife was working in Nairobi. We ran the hash there. I caught up and ran the hash in Nairobi. 3 weeks later, I was in Jordan, ran the hash there, and there he was. Yeah, small world.
Yeah,
Very small world.
good.
Jordan, good place. Again, parts of Amman I would never have seen. I think they still do away trips and stuff like that. But a really friendly, nice, welcoming bunch.
That's the thing. I think Damascus hash is again long dead.
I think so as well. Yeah, I'm guessing so.
Yeah, a lot of these places where conflict has happened have forced out
Right.
the hash. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
right.
they were great places, like great
Damascus.
places to get into. Yeah.
Oh, it's one of the most. You must have been to Damascus, I'm guessing, from Cairo. I mean, what a fantastic city it was. Yeah, what a fantastic country Syria was. Traveling around there. Yeah, that's the great advantages of doing the work that I did. Being a civil servant working for the UK government doesn't always mean that you get the best pay. I look back and I think, actually, they paid to show me the world. They paid to allow me to travel and see the world. So I'm not complaining.
You mentioned you get to hash with your 23-year-old daughter. How near does she live to you?
She was at university, so she just finished university last summer. So she comes on, she runs with me, and she's looking at what she's doing next. And in fairness to her, one of the things she said was, if I go and work in London, I'm going to join the hash because it'll mean that she'll meet some different people. And I have run with the City Hash in London, which are a much younger, faster running crowd. They're too fast for me, I'm quite honest. She'll fit in much better with that than I did.
Yeah. Some of those will hear this. What's her hash name?
I don't. She hasn't got cash name, so no, she hasn't got it.
They'll take care of that. Okay.
Yeah, but she did. Her first hashes were in a backpack in Athens on my back. Yeah, but she's hashed a little bit. Yeah, but she gets me when she runs now easily. Yeah, so it's still good, still enjoying it, and as I say, it gives me a chance to meet people, do something different, see parts of cities that I would not otherwise see. But as I say, just to repeat what I said, I do think it's it will probably remain in pockets. City Hash in London done a really good job. They're active on Instagram and Facebook and stuff, and really good job of getting a good young crowd in. And that's the sort of hash that will survive. But the hash I did last week, the joint West London Leap Year hash, it's around Westminster, central London. There were people there I hadn't seen for quite a long time, and you could just about recognise them. But they were all grey and put on a bit more weight, much like I have done as well.
It's good to catch up with you. Yeah, the hashing world comes together in these places, spreads out, and like you said, bumps into each other anywhere. So hopefully next trip to Europe will bump into you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just got to let us know when you're coming, and we'll definitely try and sort something out. But in the meantime, I think, I don't know. Yeah, I've got a Bogota on Saturday, and then I'm back to the UK for a little while, and I'll catch up with some of my hashing mates there.
You still go to the hashing in a little sports car?
You remember that? No,
It's about 2 inches off the ground.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
exactly. No, no, we sold that a little while ago. I think when the family came along, didn't quite as well for us. But that's the difference as well, running in the UK. Obviously, where I run now, I've got to drive. I've got to drive pretty much wherever I go. So that really means that the hash is that sort of real raucous spirit that you used to have when you're overseas. You have much, much less of that now because pretty much everybody has got to drive and is limited to a drink or two, and that's it. Which is why I think sometimes the hashes in London, you still have a little bit more of that slightly old-fashioned hash spirit in some ways on the drinking side anyway. And I'm not saying that there's no hash spirit in the ones that you're running out in the country in the UK, because it's still very much a hash. Like, people are still going out and setting trails, and you're setting a trail and you're still shouting and you're still taking the piss out of each other and you're still having a down and a song afterwards. So it's still there. It's just a little bit less boisterous probably than it used to be.
And some of the beers have to have a 0 on the outside. So
Well, occasionally, occasionally, yeah, exactly. You have to be careful if you know that you're in for a down. Then you have to be careful that you're not have too much before you get your down, especially if you want to drive back home. But yeah.
Sometimes that's the only thing I think some of the founders might be turned over for their graves if they see 0 alcohol beer.
Oh, it still works as long as you know.
Yeah.
Actually, it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah, no. And to be fair, I don't think those original hashes, they weren't there to drink their heads off. They were there to have several hours sipping weak shandy beers and having the same kind of camaraderie that we have today. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I think that was a great thing. I've got obviously people I've known for years and years from the hash who are still obviously great friends. So I think that as I say, it's about like-minded people, really, isn't it? And when I was younger, when I was in Delhi, when I was in Cairo, there was a lot of alcohol consumed. But as I've got a little bit older and probably can't take it quite as well as I used to, then slow down a bit. And now actually I'm hashing more for the running element of hashing rather than the beer element of hashing. Although the social side is still obviously great.
Okay, give me 1 minute. We'll say goodbye. I gotta open the door. I locked my wife out.
No worries.
Melanie went to work downtown, and we always lock our screen door by habit. So she ring the doorbell. She can come say hello in a second. I've got one standard question I got to ask you, and you can answer from your position of experience. Is the RA always right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
You can argue
as much as you want, but the RA is always right.
Yeah, anyone who's been an RA seems to get the correct answer. Hey, Melanie, come say hi to one of my friends from Cairo days, and on Simon. He's down in Bogota.
Hi. Hi, good to meet you. How's things?
Nice to meet you.
You must be a very brave person putting up with him for so long.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of our vacations are hashing, and if I had, we do the inner hash and go to Kiwi Nash Hash every 2 years. So yeah, Fantastic. It's a great.
Yeah.
Although our little nephews, her brother has 2 kids that are 14 and 10, and they're too busy to. And there's no kids their age on the Toronto hashes. So we haven't. They hear what we're doing, but we haven't put them out on it yet.
No, it's just the whole way everyone lives their life these days. So I think it was of its time, and who's to say in 20 years there will probably only be a handful of hashes around the place.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for your time.
A pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Bye.
Take care. Nice. Bye. Bye.
To close the circle, here's the hash anthem sung by Mother Hash.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot.